Very good to have your company. You know, it's a little bit like buying credit in the world's carbon bank. Carbon offsetting. It's paying towards schemes that reduce greenhouse gases. We were wondering whether it's helpful or simply a convenient way of greenwashing our pollution. This is Roundtable. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Not all of our polluting actions have to result in more greenhouse gas emissions. That is the idea of carbon offsetting, paying towards environmentally friendly projects that make up for the damage from, say, a flight we've taken. For our latest episode of Net Zero on the battle to reduce global emissions, we take a look at carbon offsetting.
Scientists warn that to avoid the worst climate impacts, global greenhouse gas emissions will not only need to drop by half by 2030, but to reach net zero around mid-century. Net zero refers to achieving an overall balance between emissions produced and emissions taken out of the atmosphere. One idea is carbon offsetting, essentially a donation or an investment in an environmental sustainable project to reduce the impact of other polluting activities. These projects range from planting trees to building new solar installations and to carbon capture. Corporations like Microsoft, Disney and General Motors have been buying offsets for years. It's also popular among airline passengers, although many of these schemes have been criticised as valuing carbon too cheaply. Airline EasyJet pays around $3.60 for each tonne of carbon it produces, compared to the EU carbon trading price of around $25. But campaigners say many carbon offset schemes lack transparency. So what exactly is it that we're paying for? Does carbon offsetting really work, or has it become a dangerous distraction from the tough job of reducing emissions?
Well, I am very pleased to say that joining us for the roundtable discussion today, we have Anja Kollmuss, an emissions trading policy analyst. She is in Zurich. We go to California next, and we say hello to Peter Miller, Director of Climate and Clean Energy Programme there. And then we go down to the south of Wales, and we welcome Mary Gagen, Professor of Geography at Swansea University. Great to have you all with us. Anja, let me ask you first of all, you have said, stop thinking you can lower your carbon footprint by offsetting. You cannot. You don't sugarcoat it, do you? It almost sounds like you think it's a waste of time.
Yeah, I've been studying offsetting mechanisms for the better of 15 years, and I think we have now come to a point where we are past offsetting. The remaining carbon budget we have is so small that really everybody needs to reduce their emissions. So that's one reason why offsetting has really passed its time. And the other reason is that it's so difficult to ensure the quality of these offsets. There are several issues that are quite difficult to address, even if we try our best to have good rules around them.
Okay, so let's put it this way. Let's say I produce half a tonne of carbon dioxide, but by planting 25 trees, which I know these numbers are totally wrong, I could produce or reduce the carbon emissions by 3 tonnes. Even that isn't good enough. It's gone too far.
Yes, it's gone too far. I mean, if we want to have a chance of staying at 1.5 degrees of warming, which the IPCC says we're already going to see really dramatic changes, we have about 8 years of emissions budget left. So really the time for thinking that we can pay someone else to reduce our emissions, their emissions in our stead, really has passed.
Okay. Peter, the suggestion seems to be, at least from Anja here, that this is virtue signalling, that when somebody like Elton John throws a ton of seeds on a hillside because he's let Prince Harry use his private jet, it's nothing more than trying to salve a conscience.
Yes, I guess I certainly share Anja's sense of urgency. Time is short. We have to do everything we can. We do have to reduce our emissions, but I think offsetting can supplement that. For many people, they will continue to travel. Elton John may continue to let Prince Harry use his jet. And for those individuals and for the rest of us who continue to take actions that result in carbon emissions, we should also plant trees, capture methane from farms and dairies, and take actions that are commonly called offsetting. For me, it's not an either or, it's an and. We need to be doing everything we
But
can.
it's simply not making the situation worse, perhaps, Mary, rather than improving it.
Yeah, I think what is really interesting is perhaps what, as a climate scientist, I see as beneficial to offsetting programs are exactly what you exemplified very nicely at the start. You asked, if I fly and it produces this amount of CO2, what can I do? We need people as a step one to actually start thinking about defining their carbon footprint and looking at ways that they can make reductions in their own lives. Anything that helps us have conversations about our carbon footprint, I have time for. So I think with those behavioural changes, offsetting has some relevancy there. But as Anja was saying at the start, since offsetting programs appeared, these projects have saved around a gigaton of carbon. To put that in context, in terms of carbon equivalent, we in 2018 emitted 33 gigatons of carbon equivalent. So they are an absolute drop in the ocean. But if they have the capacity to help people start to think about their personal carbon footprint, that's great. However, the IPCC has made it clear that we need rapid, unprecedented scale changes in every section of society if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change.
Well, let me ask you this. Okay, so 1 gigaton has been saved, which is roughly 1/3 of what has been produced. But there are other things like carbon capture. Are we actually in any way, with all of these carbon net zero plans, are we doing anything that is actually creating a better future rather than reducing a very bad present?
That's a really good way of looking at it. I'm not sure that we have the option to split hairs between those two things. We need to do everything that we can as fast as possible in every sector of society, manufacturing, industry, really everything that we can. We've just had an announcement that we've actually, for the first time, gone above 1 degrees above baseline in the average global temperature. That was 2019 was the first year that we were actually at 1.1 degree, with some parts of the world actually at 2 degrees above average. So we're already in the realm of what the IPCC are talking about in terms of climate change becoming dangerous. So we need everything. We can't really split hairs about, well, let's do this, but let's not do that. We need to do it all.
Okay, well, all three of you can come say something at any particular time. You don't necessarily have to wait for me to ask a question. And Anja, I saw you sort of looking like you wanted to join in then.
May I just say a couple of things? I totally agree that we need everything. What I find, and I think we need to distinguish between voluntary offsetting and a compliance market. In a compliance market, say a company in the European emissions trading scheme has an obligation to reduce their emissions. And they can do that either by reducing their own emissions or by buying such carbon offsets. So if those carbon offsets do not come from a project that was actually reducing additional emissions, we actually see a global increase in emissions. And I've been on a couple of research projects where we really carefully looked at the two largest offsetting mechanisms, the CDM and JI, and we found about...
Do you want to help us with what that is? What do you think? It'll go over the top of my head and others as well.
Yeah, these are the clean development mechanism and joint implementation. These are the two large offsetting mechanisms that were implemented under the Kyoto Protocol. And those are the two mechanisms that have the most projects implemented, and they will generate about 3 billion credits by the end of...
Can I ask you this, and this is for any one of you. If we're agreed, and pretty much it seems to be that way, that more needs to be done, and that what is being done at the moment is only just touching the edges of this major problem. And airlines, let's use airlines as an example. Delta, British Airways, Qantas, whoever it happens to be, is doing something, but that something is not enough. Don't we need to tell them to do more?
I think that's absolutely the point. So one of the things that I think is so important about the kinds of work that Anja does is it shows us how incredibly complex these offsetting tradings and values are. So, for example, at the moment, EasyJet, I think, given a value of about £3, so £3 sterling per ton of carbon, when they look at their valuations, and those are, way, way, way low what we need to be valuing carbon for. The IPCC talk about values that are tens of pounds per ton of carbon. So we need that transparency where, when it comes down to it, this is about consumer behavior. And if I'm needing to look at offsetting my travel and I maybe want to look at a planting program, I need to make sure the information I've been given is transparent and quantifiable and actually meaningful.
Let's try and get a context out of that. £3 for every ton of carbon. How many flights do you need to make to emit a ton of carbon? Mary, just carry on, since that was your point.
I haven't a clue.
Okay, so I'm wondering if it's one flight. Oh, sorry, Anja, are you there?
So it depends a little bit. If you're just looking at CO2 emissions, if you have a transatlantic flight, say from Frankfurt to New York, you emit about 1 ton of CO2.
Therefore, for that, EasyJet is paying £3 only. That is scandalous, isn't it?
Well, that's per person.
Okay, that's per person. So let's say they've got 300 people. They're paying £1,000 for all that stuff junk they've thrown into the air.
Anja, have I got this right? That the EU currently trades carbon at £21 per ton. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's in the emissions trading scheme. The prices have risen there a little bit, but they don't have to pay for that. EasyJet does not have to pay for that because only the inner European flights are in the emissions trading scheme. But just to add what I wanted to say,
I'll come back to you, Peter. Be patient. I'll come back to you in just a moment. You can't see this probably, but you are flanked by the two other experts, and you're sitting there in California right in the middle. We will get back to you.
That's a comfortable place to be.
Sorry, who was talking? Anja.
I just wanted to add that CO2 emissions are just one part of the climate impact you have from flying. There is a host of other impacts you have by flying. So you basically need to multiply this 1 ton for an Atlantic flight by about 2 or 3.
Okay, therefore, we're agreed that they're not paying their fair share. Towards the end of the programme, we'll find out whether enforcing this is possible. Peter, let's come to you now. In your conversations with our producer, you talked about one particular scheme that got a bad name, and that was one in China. Yeah, do you want to tell us about that? And then tell us what you're doing in California that is the mirror opposite of that.
Sure. And I think both Anja and Mary making the very good point. Not only do we have no time to waste, not taking action to address this crisis, we also don't have time to do things that aren't really making a difference. So it's critically important that the policies and the programs that we put in place actually do reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help to improve the climate, our impact on the climate. So in California, we have a program in place where we've capped our greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide and are taking actions across the economy, transportation, buildings, industry, to reduce those emissions. Part of that program incorporates a compliance offset program that is quite restrictive and limits the types of projects that can participate and establishes clear, unambiguous guidance on how those projects participate and how they quantify the emission reductions that they're required to achieve.
But you did mention this bad one in China, and that is an example of where somebody did something, virtue signaling, if you like, just sort of saying, hang on, look, we're doing a good job here. But in fact, it was the exact opposite.
Yeah, no, in fact, it was worse than virtue signaling because what the project did was it was a factory in China that made refrigerants. They're used in air conditioning systems. And the refrigerant was a bad, very highly potent greenhouse gas. And they were given offset credit for destroying that refrigerant so that it didn't go to the atmosphere and increase temperatures. But it was so lucrative that they ended up manufacturing more of the refrigerant just so they could get credit for destroying it.
Yeah.
Obviously, not a benefit to the climate, and in fact, a net detriment because other projects would not reduce their emissions because they were counting on the credit from this project.
Yeah. So you deliberately make something bad to get paid for taking it out of the environment. It's quite clever. Mary, yeah.
I just wanted to come back on that with regards to planting programs as well, because what Peter's described is a situation with regards to the tree planting programs as well. We desperately do need to increase planting of trees in the right places where they're going to grow and be laid down for a long time. And tree planting programs have a certain appeal to customers because they can get their head around them. And you're seeing something happening in response to your emissions. But there have been investigations that have found private companies, particularly in Africa, buying carbon credits from airlines and then using those carbon credits to essentially force indigenous peoples off land that they need for farming and then planting in those locations in areas where the trees are not going to thrive because the climate is not right for them. So that kind of lack of transparency around these tree planting programs is really problematic.
And there are also tree planting programs I have heard that where somebody announces they've planted, let's say, 1 million trees, and 900,000 of those are dead within a year, and yet they're still holding their hands up and saying absolutely fantastic, not just in Africa, but in Western countries as well.
So tree planting, trees are going to be really important because they help buy us a little bit of time, and we can start planting now, and we need to start planting now because they take decades until they're big. But if you don't plant the right trees in the right places, they don't thrive and they die. If you bulldoze them and put that material back into the atmosphere, that also doesn't help. And you can also do some really problematic things if you plant forests in parts of the globe where the surface of the earth is pale at the moment and reflecting sunlight. Forests are darker, and so you actually make the problem worse because more radiation is trapped in that dark forest.
Well, you actually trap the heat, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, rather than reflect it back in. Anja, there was something you wanted to say?
Yeah, let me just put some figures on this. So we looked at all the different project types in those two large offsetting mechanisms, and we found about 3/4 of the credits did not result in the emissions reductions they claimed to have reduced. So, and that's, that's looking at all different project types. So that's really quite staggering.
So 75% were useless or worse than useless.
And the problem is if they are used for compliance. So we did kind of a back of the envelope calculation, and we calculated that these two mechanisms actually harmed the global climate by around 1 billion tons of CO2, because in comparisons, if the companies that have a compliance obligation had reduced their emissions themselves.
This is one for every single one of you, but Peter hasn't said anything for a while, so I'll go to you first of all. You've identified that there are poor schemes out there, each and every one of you. It's not just massive corporations that try to carbon offset. It's people like me, my children, my friends, want to go and plant a tree, want to do something, contribute. How do you spot the good plans from the bad plans?
There are a number of things that consumers should look for. And some of the comments Anja and Mary have made point to the key issues. There needs to be clear transparency around the project. So it's important that the project be available for inspection so that you can know what they're claiming and whether the claims are valid. Another thing to look for is you don't want forward crediting. You want people giving credit for things that are going to happen in the future. Rather, they should only get credit for things that they've actually achieved. Don't credit a company for the carbon that trees will sequester decades in the future. Credit them for the carbon that those trees have already sequestered.
So you don't give people a promissory note. You say deliver and then we'll give you the money, or whatever it is.
And if that carbon gets re-released in the atmosphere, the trees get bulldozed or burned up, they have to pay back that credit. They're on the line.
I wonder why this sort of thing isn't happening now. Let's go to Anja for that one. Mary, I will bring you back in just a sec.
It's actually really, really difficult to determine if a project is a good project or not, because it might look like an excellent project, like a renewable energy project, but there the issue is that the project was built not because of the revenue it makes from the offsets, but mostly because of the electricity it sells. So that's called non-additional, and a lot of projects are actually such projects. So it's not so much, we have some projects where there was real cheating, but most of them, it's just really hard. So as a more radical suggestion for consumers, I would say, great that you want to do something for the climate. If you find a good project, by all means support it. Don't think you can somehow eliminate your own carbon footprint with it. Just think of it as a good support of a climate project. And also think about, if you have money you want to spend and you know we really need fundamental changes, wouldn't it be spent more wisely on a political organization that pushes for the kind of policy changes we really need?
Well, you have to hope then that there are some honest politicians out there who are going to do what you hope they do. Mary, what about something we had here, or maybe we still have here in Britain, the kite mark? It sort of identified that a product was safe and that you could therefore go and use it, whether it be a piece of glassware, you'd look to know that it wouldn't break in your hand, or whether it was a seatbelt or whatever. Is there any way for officialdom to identify for us which of these plans are actually going to be worthwhile and or viable?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because at the moment it's up to consumers to do their own research to define that, and that's not really a realistic expectation. So, for example, if I wanted to plant some trees to offset what I was doing, I would be far better looking at one of our woodland charities. So the UK is a good place to plant trees because our climate's going to get wetter and the trees will be able to thrive in our climate. But I would not be using an airline's offsetting system. I would be going to our woodland charities. And a real key thing actually is almost to avoid the word offsetting. Look for planting charities that talk about carbon donation, where they are planting a tree that they can tell you the species, they can tell you where it's going to be, and they can tell you that it's going to be on land that's going to be stewarded and looked after.
And presumably they could also tell you which of the trees that they're planting will grow the fastest and not only reach maturity before other ones, but also be capable of absorbing more carbon dioxide than others.
Absolutely. And everything else that we need. We're not just facing a crisis in our climate system, we're facing a crisis in our natural system as well. So an oak tree, for example, in the UK, a mature 400-year-old oak tree puts out about 250,000 litres of oxygen a year and can support up to 2,000 other species. So in the UK, we need to be supporting our native woodland to do well. Planting conifer plantation is not the right thing to do.
Now, you see, that's funny, because I would have thought, this is for all of you, I would have thought that an oak tree is going to take 60, 70 years to reach any kind of maturity, and therefore why should I bother with that when it's not going to do anything in my lifetime, or maybe even my children's lifetime? Peter, what do you reckon?
People really have to do everything they can, and they shouldn't say, I've spent my small amount on offsetting my plane flight, but consider not taking the plane flight to begin with. And when they land, they should consider renting an electric car and other actions that they can take to reduce their emissions. Offsets can be, if done right, and I certainly support the idea of investing in a local woodland charity or other tree planting organization. We need to be doing everything we can.
Okay, and Anja, we've talked an awful lot about woodland and types of trees and money that you can pay if you are already kicking out an awful lot of pollution. But what are other reasonable ways of offsetting?
Well, as I said before, my main argument would be, we are in such dire straits right now. We need very significant policy changes. Otherwise, personal action is very important, and it can maybe nudge policy action, but we need policies. So I would say, don't waste your money on offsets.
Don't waste your money on offsets. On the other hand, as we come towards the end of this program, I would have to say, in defense of offsets, that it is actually a nudge to the conscience of humankind, is it not? If somebody thinks about offsetting in some sort of way, then they are probably also thinking perhaps about eating less meat, driving, as Peter says, an electric car, and so on, Anja.
Not sure. It could also be just, to kind of calm your conscience. I mean, we've been saying this, I've been saying this for almost 25 years. So, I'm not quite sure, I've passed beyond telling people to purchase offsets. I'm now saying it's politics.
Okay, Mary, you wanted to join us at this particular point. We're getting towards the end.
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mean, those behavioral changes are going to take such a long time to embed. We need to start now. And those behavioral changes happen when we have mechanisms to look at our lives, look at our carbon footprint, take kids out into the woodland and think about the trees that are there and think about that in relation to the way we are spending carbon in our lives. And we need every mechanism we can to just help people actually get their head around the complexities of climate change and the level of changes we all need to make to our lives. But it should not distract us from the huge emissions reductions policies that we need.
Listen, thank you. Anja, Peter, Mary, we appreciate your time here on Roundtable, and we appreciate the fact that you have taken the trouble to watch this programme, Net Zero. I hope you've learned a little bit more than that, but from me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, for now, thank you for watching, and goodbye.